Joining us on the Mercedes-Benz Vans phone line, ESPN NFL insider and the co-host of the Fantasy Focus Football Podcast here on the Rich Eisen Show. Mercedes-Benz Vans phone line is Field Yates. How are you, Field?
Rich, I'm doing well. It's starting to feel a little bit more like the football season.
It is.
Training camp's underway and padded practice is not that far behind.
Yes, I sometimes cramp up. I'm not ready for it. I need to be a little bit more
you and I both
hydrated. I need a little bit more water, but maybe not during this interview. I think I'm going to get through it just fine. So let me just hit you with the question I've been asking everybody from the world of NFL media over the last several days. The most intriguing team for you entering 2022 is which, Field?
I'm going to go with the Chargers. And the reason why is they've been a team that, even going back to when Phillip Rivers was their quarterback, felt tantalizingly close to being in the contention race in the AFC and potentially a Super Bowl contender as well. And this year, and maybe I'm taking the bait and maybe I'm overreacting to some of the offseason moves, but it feels as though this year they are closer than ever. And it's not just because of the additions of Khalil Mack and J.C. Jackson and Kyle Van Noy and others on defense, Zion Johnson on offense, and some other pieces added as well. I think it's just because Justin Herbert has a chance to get even better than he was last year, which is sort of a scary thought when you look at how he performed last season. We're talking about a guy who, I know it sounds a little bit hyperbolic, but could one day set like individual season passing records, whether it's passing yards, passing touchdowns. He's just getting started, and he already feels like one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL.
Speaking of just getting started, are you holding the Rookie of the Year while conducting this interview right now, Field? Are you doing that right now?
You know something, Rich? You are spot on. I'm on daddy daycare today as my wife is she's a coach, so she's at camp today. And so I've been daddy daycare duties, and normally this would be the time that my daughter is down. But she has decided to change up her schedule. She called the audible on me, so I'm trying to keep her down, or keep her quiet, I should say.
It's okay,
Field. She's got some thoughts on the Chargers as well.
She's called in Omaha on you, huh, Field? Okay. What's her name? What's her name? What's your baby's name?
This is Kinley. She's 6 months old, and she was born on the Friday of the divisional round of the NFL playoffs this year, which I know you will recall was, in some people's estimations, the greatest divisional round the league has ever seen.
Yes.
And every competitive NFL game she's seen since then has been decided in dramatic fashion. So no pressure, Rams and Bills, when you guys get started in 6 weeks from tonight. But if you don't hold up your end of the bargain, she may never be a football fan.
Well, for your wife's sake, I hope her birth was was less eventful than every single playoff game that followed. Field, I'll just say that.
Fortunately, it was. Yeah.
Okay, so very good. So the Chargers, huh? So, oh man, I've been picking the Raiders to win the division. Talk me out of it. Go for it if you want to.
Well, here's I mean, I could make the case for the Chargers as an AFC favorite. I could also make the case that they might finish fourth in their own division, and that's not necessarily because they have glaring weaknesses, but to your point, the Raiders, the Chiefs, the Broncos, I mean, any single one of those teams could have a formidable case as the AFC West favorite going into this year. I don't really have a great counterpoint working against any of them, to be honest, Rich. It's more, I would say, that somebody has to finish in last place, right? Somebody has to go maybe 7-10 or maybe 8-9 as opposed to 12-5. And so I think that when you sort of play out each of their schedules, you and I and 25 other people that follow the league closely could do so and come up with 25 different outcomes. The Raiders, probably the biggest question mark for me coming into the season. We've still got a long way to go before we actually play games. But the offensive line, which in recent years felt like it was trending towards a strength, over the past couple of years, it's been broken up a bit. There was the Rodney Hudson trade, Richie Incognito retired. They're still trying to figure out what to do with last year's first-round pick, Alex Leatherwood. So the Raiders' offensive line has my attention, but in that division, every offensive line, specifically the right side of the offensive line, has my attention because if it's not Khalil Mack one week, it could be Bradley Chubb the next week. It could be, not just be applicable to the Raiders, Max Crosby or Chandler Jones the following week. So a right tackle may not get paid on average as much as a left tackle, but you could make the case that in the AFC West, they're just as important.
Field Yates, NFL insider from ESPN and Father of the Year here on the Rich Eisen Show. So Week 1, Jimmy Garoppolo will be where? Field.
Man, I think Seattle. And that also means that I don't believe that the 49ers will find a trade partner, as I can't imagine a scenario in which they would trade him to Seattle unless Seattle said you can have DK Metcalf or a first-round pick or some gargantuan package, which I don't think any of us could ever foresee Seattle offering. But I think eventually the 49ers realize that the powder's dry in terms of opportunities to trade Jimmy Garoppolo, and at $24.2 million for a base salary, that's just too expensive to have as your backup quarterback, even if he is a really, really good insurance policy. If the number were a dramatically reduced figure, we'd be having a different conversation. I think that just go around the NFL, spin the wheel of quarterbacks, and there's really only one team that I could make the case right now against having their week 1 starter on the roster right now. I mean, there are teams that certainly are going to have quarterback turnover next offseason. We'll see what happens with the New York Giants. We'll see what happens with the Houston Texans if they have a high draft pick and they still have Davis Mills. We'll see what happens with the Carolina Panthers, as an example, as both Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield are in the final year of their rookie contracts. But for now, I think all of those teams are more likely to go with the in-house option and try to develop either a young player in the case of Daniel Jones and also Davis Mills, or the two guys in their 5th year in Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield.
So who do you think wins that competition in Carolina? Field, what do you think?
I think it's Baker Mayfield. And I sort of laughed at first when GM Scott Fitterer called it a competition, because it's not as if they paid a significant amount to Baker Mayfield. They are actually paying him less this year than Sam Darnold. And also the draft pick sent back to Cleveland was, that was in terms of draft parlance, like that was a relative bargain. But Baker Mayfield is a better player than Sam Darnold. And I know that neither of them has been the model of consistency during their career. But Baker Mayfield's best football has been, at least in my estimation, far better than Sam Darnold through the first 4 seasons of their career. And things went really, really wrong last year for Baker in Cleveland, between the injuries, between what felt like just a bad dynamic between the head coach and the quarterback, which is hardly ever a recipe for success in the league. And then also a team that, looked out of the gates when they played Kansas City really tough in week 1, like they had a chance to be the real deal, and the wheels fell off. And the past 2 years, the entire league has obviously been dealing with things like COVID complications and lack of practice time and inconsistent availability. And it felt like last year was the perfect storm for Baker Mayfield. I don't know that he's going to be a long-term starter in Carolina, but I think he's at least the week 1 starter, and I'd guess much of this year's starter as well.
Field Yates, ESPN NFL insider here on the Rich Eisen Show. The team that can be the surprise division winner is which, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it feels as though a lot of the teams that made the playoffs last year, in the NFC at least, are pretty well positioned to get back there this season. The Packers in the NFC North feel like their path is fairly clear. We all believe in the Bucs again. Same thing for the Rams. And then the Cowboys and Eagles. One of those two teams seems likely to win the NFC East. So, I don't know if Baltimore is really a surprise. So I think they're probably too trendy. Maybe that's too much of the low-hanging fruit for me to grab. But a team that finished with a losing record last year at 8-9, a team that obviously stumbled to the finish, largely due to injuries and the fact that Lamar Jackson was not available for them. That will be my team. But I think maybe if I'm going to pick maybe a bigger surprise, I suppose if your Raiders pick is accurate, that might be a bigger surprise, not because the Raiders were worse than the Ravens last year. They were a playoff team, but just because the mountain they'd have to climb over in the AFC West this year would be more significant. The AFC is, and you've been covering this league for a long time, I can't recall a year in which the AFC or any conference, either conference, has ever had this kind of depth, 1 through maybe not 16, but maybe like 1 through 13 or 14. It's a really, really deep year.
I got one for you. How about Philadelphia? What do you think about them? What about the Eagles?
Yeah, no, I'd be in on Philly as well. And every year during the offseason, because the NFL offseason is longer than any other sport, we have a ton of time to not just see moves play out, but also think about a variety of moves and develop and formulate opinions. And sometimes we try to find the opinion that no one else has shared before and be super unique. And then sometimes I come back to the same things that I thought at the beginning of the offseason. And that's where I'm at with the Eagles, is that I like a lot of what they did. A.J. Brown is a bona fide star receiver, and I thought that in the draft they got better in a hurry with Jordan Davis in the first round, potentially Nakobe Dean, his college teammate, in the third round being an instant starter. But Jalen Hurts is kind of a ceiling setter for Philadelphia, right? I think we all agree they're going to be pretty good this year. If Jalen Hurts takes a step forward and looks like a much evolved player from where he was against Tampa in that playoff game last year, then Philly could push for 12 wins and be a division winner. And because their division is not as stacked as perhaps the NFC West, like they could be, they could at least compete for a top 3 record in the NFC this year, and it shouldn't surprise any of us.
Last one for you, Field Yates. Put your fantasy football hat on. Many drafts going down right now, if not right now, in the next couple of weeks. Who's a consensus first overall pick in fantasy, do you think, this year?
It's going to end up being Jonathan Taylor this year, Rich. And Christian McCaffrey has a very viable case. But Jonathan Taylor last year led the NFL in rushing attempts, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, rushes of at least 20 yards. He had 40 catches last season. And there's an old fantasy mantra that you really can't win your league in the first round, but you can lose your league in the first round. And if you take Christian McCaffrey, which I am not going to try anybody that does, and his injury luck continues, and over the past couple of years he's had very little injury luck, then you could be looking at a lost season. Jonathan Taylor has not missed a game during his pro career. At one point there was talk, I believe it was during the game on Saturday night late last season when they played in primetime against the Patriots, where it was like an incredible note shared where he hadn't missed a practice since like middle school. So as far as availability is concerned, few players offered as much as Jonathan Taylor does. So I would say that he is the consensus first overall pick in fantasy, and deservedly so.
Who's the first receiver off the board, do you think, or should be?
Yeah, I think we're going to go back to the well here with Cooper Kupp. And, there have been seasons similar to Kupp's last year, like Michael Thomas's back for the Saints when he set the single-season catch record that did not sustain the following year. Again, injuries can play a concern there. But with Cooper Kupp, led the NFL in not just catches, receiving yards, touchdowns, but also had the most catches of at least 20 yards. Not like this guy is 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 yards per catch. He's a legitimate big play threat, and he had 7 targets in every game last year. That's an incredible run of consistency. I know the Rams added Allen Robinson, but as things presently stand, no Odell Beckham Jr. for this team. And even if they do have OBJ back, we all suspect it might be more of maybe a November/December and January impact for OBJ as opposed to an early season splash for him. So I think Cooper Kupp is, as far as safe picks go, even if he doesn't repeat last year's success, he'll end up being a worthwhile first-round pick.
And then the breakout star that you think either played last year or could be a rookie that you would want to come away your fantasy draft having. Who's that?
I'm feeling pretty good about Darnell Mooney, who, if you go back to last year, it's not as if he was off the fantasy radar. Huh. He was a top 20 wide receiver, but you go back to the second half of last year, and part of this is because the Bears did not have Allen Robinson in the lineup very much, but it was like every game, you just look at the game logs, and it's like 8 to 10 targets, well over 100 yards during games. Really talented guy who's worked extremely hard this offseason with Justin Fields. The two of them have trained together in Atlanta. There is a rapport there, and as has been discussed plenty of this offseason, the Bears went more of the journeyman route for wide receivers that they added this year. They added a guy, there are examples like Byron Pringle from Kansas City, Bayless Jones, a third-round pick out of Tennessee, who I think is going to be a good player. But if the Bears had approached this offseason differently at wide receiver, I might feel differently. But Darnell Mooney seems to be he could be a guy that finishes the end of the year with maybe like a top 10 target share in the entire league, just based off who Chicago has or doesn't have available. Outside
of David Montgomery, are you allowed to draft a Bear in fantasy football? I'm just wondering if I guess you got to check everybody's buy rules. I guess Javonte Williams is the one that I keep hearing that people are just coveting, thinking that now Russ is there and he was terrific last year in his role whenever he got the ball, and Nathaniel Hackett coming in, that he's going to have some sort of Aaron Jones type year. What do you think?
Yeah, I would love to see that one. And he's another good example of a guy that, based off of where he finished last year and where he started last year as well, is being drafted well ahead of that pace. He had 1 week last year where Melvin Gordon was not on the field as the starter. And in that 1 week, Javonte Williams finished with more fantasy points than any other running back in the league that week. So he had nearly 25 against the Chiefs. It was a Sunday night game where he was awesome. I think the concern, and I use concern very relatively, I would not say major concern. I think I actually was just doing a refresh this morning of my rankings, and he's right on the borderline of the top 10 for my running backs. It's just that Melvin Gordon was re-signed, and I think Melvin Gordon's still a really solid running back. He's had at least 6 rushing touchdowns in every year of his career, and I'll be curious because last year, this is almost like one of those, I don't know about too good to believe, but almost you have to double check it because it seems so unlikely. The two of them had, in terms of 50-50 workloads, the same number of rushing attempts, almost the same number of rushing yards. Gordon had the edge in rushing touchdowns. If that turns into a 70-30 split in favor of Javonte Williams, then I'll be too low on him. If it's more like 55-45 or 60-40, then maybe some of the expectation for Javonte Williams will look a little bit lofty going into the season.
Field Yates, thank you so very much for the time. Greatly appreciate it, fitting us into your busy schedule of being on TV and also being a dad. And so your daughter, not only Rookie of the Year, I think we haven't heard her in the last 12 minutes, comeback Player of the Year as well. 2 awards for her. Well done.
They say during the football season, you just got to get better from training camp until Thanksgiving, when the playoffs start to feel a little real, and then eventually January. So she's a January player. She was born in January. It's fitting that she performs her best in the metaphorical January stage of this interview.
Well, or she was spending the last 15 minutes in independent study time. We'll find out later on. We'll watch later on for that answer.
All right, that sounds good.
At Field Yates on Twitter. Check him out. ESPN NFL Insider Field Yates on The Rich Eisen Show.